Paloma for the invitation, and even though it was a relatively short notice, I have a sense, as I know many others in this room do, that it's important that conversations of matters in the public domain, conversations that are critical to what societies are all about, conversations that enable us to broaden our intellectual horizons, those conversations we have. And to the extent that I can, in any way, at any time, in any country, enable, facilitate those conversations, I try to be responsive, particularly when it's people who I respect, like Corona, as for their contribution. But I also am delighted to be able to reconnect, and Corona made this reference in her remarks, people who I have not seen for a while. Connect to people who I have known for a long time. I'm delighted that my professor of almost 40 years ago, Harold Dutchman, is able to brave the weather. Hope you didn't need this thing on Harold. But I'm delighted to be able to spend some time with friends who can go to the next slide. I met a couple of colleagues who reminded me that they were part of conversations that I led last year, January. I had the opportunity to respond positively to the invitation of a friend, Ambassador Brent Hart. And Brent brought me to Guyana as a guest of the Department of State. And one of the conversations I had was at a police training school. One was in this very room. And I'm hoping that what we have this evening would mirror some of the intellectual engagement and learning, not only in my delivery, but on the part of questions and comments on the part of the entire collective sharing tonight's intellectual experience. Next slide, please. Some of you may know the name Frank Campbell, a former information minister, a former diplomat, former distinguished public servant, but you also might know the name Desmond Roberts. Desmond Roberts is chairman of the board, editorial board of something called Diaspora Times. It's a publication produced by Guyanese who are in the diaspora. Frank is in Canada. Desmond and Claire and a bunch of their Matthews are in New York. And after the elections, Frank asked me to write a short commentary on the election's outcome. And I said to Frank, I'm going to do something that I think is going to be important for the conversations going forward. And so I spent some time, very short article, which if I were to have an opportunity, I would amplify, pondering and responding to the question of what is the challenge of this new government in terms of managing expectations. And I began my article by recalling something that many of us, I'm hoping all of us, would have encountered at some point in our intellectual growth. And that is a work by Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities. And so I began my article in the Diaspora Times of May 29 by saying, our native land's contemporary realities call to mind words by Charles Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, etc., etc. And the point I was making there is that we are caught in an interesting time in Guyana. And part of the reality of the time in which we find ourselves has to do with the regime change. The regime change coming in the aftermath of so much that needs to be fixed. Therefore, creating high expectations by the citizens about fixings. Go to the next slide. My proposition was and is, if you were to ask the question, what are the critical
expectation areas. What are the things that citizens have a certain anxiety about being fixed relatively quickly? Because so much was broken, so much was damaged, so much is in need of improvement. I identified 5 key areas. I argue that inclusion, the question of national unity is critical. I argue that security and economics and education and integrity, none of these issues is in a silo by itself. They're all linked. They're not necessarily offered there in any rank order of importance. And so when Paloma asked me to do this, I said, why don't I revisit a little bit? Use perhaps as an epigraph what I said at the beginning of that article, calling on the words of Charles Dickens, and spend some time, next slide please, spend some time talking about what in the area of security are some of the expectations, management challenges and opportunities of the current new administration. Now, as I thought of how I would frame the conversation, my mind went back to a project that was led in the 1990s, the late 1990s, by some colleagues, Michael Desch, Forde and Andres Servin. Out of that project came a book called From Pirates to Drug Lords. And in the preface to that, the introductory chapter to that book, which was written by Forde said something there which to me is quite apposite as part of the leveraging of the conversation about expectations in regard to security. And what he said there, and he was talking about Caribbean writ large, the most common sources of insecurity in the Caribbean affect the quotidian experiences of ordinary people. Now, Dr. Hector Butts is wondering, next slide please, what are some of these quotidian experiences of ordinary people? That there is anxiety, that there are high expectations about doing something, changing the experiences. But I thought, let me, as a kind of organizing mechanism, go back to something by a gentleman who I first learned about in high school. Didn't know he was a philosopher till I got to college, but I knew him as a mathematician. Bertrand Russell. What Bertrand Russell said way back in the 30s is something that I've used quite often as a kind of way of organizing the conversation. He said, you know, sometimes it's a healthy thing now and then to hang a question mark on things you long take for granted. All the more important to hang a question mark on things which you don't know much about. And so what I thought we might do in my part of the conversation is to hang a couple of question marks on things that relate to change, things that relate to expectations, and things that relate to quotidian experiences, the everyday experiences of Guyanese people. And so my proposal is to spend a few minutes asking the first question: what are some of these sources of insecurity? What are some of these sources of insecurity that people are anxious about? They have high expectations about. They are anticipating that this new government, this new regime, will do something about. But I think it's important to go beyond that first question to ask the second question. The second question is, what are some of the strategic and tactical measures, as a person who likes to go beyond just describing what is and pondering what might be to improve what is? I thought it would be important for us to spend a little bit of time saying, from my vantage point initially, here are some things that I think this new government, in managing the expectations in these arenas where there are quotidian experiences that people are anxious to change. And so I'll give you my take and invite you to offer commentary, next slide please, Vincent, on those two questions. If you're asking for a short, quick answer to the question, what are the sources and challenges, I think it's relatively easy to identify at least two. One, having an internal domain significantly, crime, but one having an external domain that has impact on the internal domain. And so my proposition is that the short answer to the question, what are these sources of insecurity? What are these issues where your expectations have changed? What are these issues that are quotidian? They're not theoretical. They are issues that on an everyday basis, citizens, individual, corporate, and civic have to contend with. Crime is number one, and territorial claims number two. But I would bet you $100 of Vince Adams' money.
What?
He's a rich man, you know, can't look at the professor, he ain't got no money. Vince Adams will be asking the question, what do we mean by security? Do you remember what Voltaire used to drive people crazy with? Before we have a conversation, monsieur, define your terms. And it was a proposition well worth noting, because particularly in an area of security which is a contested area, there are so many different definitions of what security and insecurity are. I often prefer, particularly in contested areas like this, to begin by clarifying what I mean by as a basis for the conversation. And so, before I go to my response to the question number one, I think it's important for me to clarify what do I mean by security, and therefore what do I mean by insecurity, but then ask a question which may be implicit in the minds of anybody. Well, let me make a pause to say this. Anybody who's found sleeping in this lecture will have to pay. And I'm appointing Mr. Malcolm Harry Paul to be the keeper of the sleepers. You look around, anybody, you got to give $500. We're going to put it in the fund to ensure that the University of Ghana Library gets a contribution. No sleeping in this conversation. We know that people have expectations about change. I think it would be interesting to spend a minute asking the question, why? Why are people anxious to see change in security and crime? Why are people anxious to see some different dynamic as an outcome in how the management of our external relations vis-a-vis claims, next slide please. So in response to the question of what we mean by security, I want to go to a book written by this guy called Ivelaw Griffith. This friend of mine, Ivelaw Griffith, wrote a book in 1993, and I've tried to follow his proposition of what security is. I said in 1993 when I wrote that book, for me, security has to do with protection and preservation of freedom of people in society, from external military attack and coercion, from internal subversion, and from erosion of cherished political, economic, and social values. You may not agree with my definition, but that is mine. And that is the one I've tried to live by intellectually ever since I got into this business of saying, let's define our terms, remembering the admonition of Voltaire in that respect. And therefore, I view insecurity as a condition where society's inhabitants, individual, corporate, and other citizens are facing some threats to their safety, are facing some threats to their governability. And some of those threats are going to be internal in some societies, some of those threats are going to be external. Guyana happens to have the dubious distinction of having both internal and external coming into a confluence at times that are not propitious given the economic condition of society. And so I wanted to share as a kind of paying homage to what Voltaire said, just help you understand where I'm coming from, what I mean by security, what I mean by insecurity. Next slide, please, before we go too far. Now, I suspect that some people in this audience would have read some of my writings over the last decades. And I've always embraced the proposition that insofar as my approach to security is concerned, it's not my singular approach to security. You've got to take a holistic approach. Security for small states and not so small states doesn't relate only to military things. It has to do with economic variables. It has to do with political vulnerability. As a matter of fact, I recall giving a talk in Argentina in the 80s when the OAS Hemispheric Security Committee was very active. Ambassador Ivelaw Lloyd as we might remember, Ambassador Mayer. And a diplomat from Colombia came to me afterward and said, Professor Griffith, I never know that bananas could be an economic, could be a security issue until I met the Prime Minister of Dominica. He talked bananas, almost wrote him bananas. And the indigenous child was not talking so much about bananas, the fruit. She was talking about banana, the fruit being a very important economic fulcrum around which Dominica and so many other Caribbean societies economies revolve. And there were a threat to the banana industry, means a threat to economy, which has political potential for dominoes and military potential for dominoes. And so I've always taken the view that you've got to talk multidimensional. You've got to talk both internal and external. And you've got to talk not only about traditional things. The non-traditional security issues are just as germane to the safety of citizens, to the governability of societies as those that are traditional. Next slide, please.